All right. Everyone able to see my screen and hear me? Great. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm Megan. I'm currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Illinois at Chicago, but I've been interested in studying birds in agriculture for quite a while now, and I've looked at a variety of different agricultural systems, including the California organic farms that I'm going to be talking about today. I've also done some work looking at birds on coffee farms in Kenya, and then most recently, my research has been focused on birds in these vast corn and soybean fields in the Midwest of the United States. So I am in Illinois, and that's the system that I've been looking at. I'm not really going to be talking about that today, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. So we have heard about all of the benefits of hedgerows a lot today, which has been awesome. And I wanted to share an experiment that I conducted to study the effects of the habitat surrounding a field on the pest control services that are provided by birds, specifically in row crop agriculture. So there's going to be a lot of overlap with some of the things that Sasha talked about, but this is sort of a different study system as well. So when I was designing this experiment, which was a while ago now, a lot of most of the previous research that had been done looking at pest control by birds in agriculture was done in agricultural systems that have more vertical structure than row crops. So places like coffee farms, vineyards, and the orchards that we'd heard about in Sasha's work. These types of agriculture that have a lot of vertical structure are great places to find birds because birds tend to like that vertical structure. So the structure of the crops themselves will affect the bird activity that we can expect to see. So for instance, we probably won't expect to see a woodpecker down in low growing row crops because they tend to specialize on trees. So because row crops are so widely grown, I was interested in learning more about the services that we might expect to see by birds in these lower growing crops. Could we expect to see the same services that birds had been already shown to provide in these taller crops in low row crops as well? So this photo was provided by Emily of a hedgerow at Davis Ranches. This is a pretty standard field next to this really beautiful shrubby hedgerow. And this is exactly this type of row crop system that I was interested in studying. I wanted to know what local scale, so what really small scale variables affected the probability within a farm that a bird could provide pest control. And I should mention here that when I say pest control in this talk, I'm really only going to be focusing on arthropod or insect pest control. Although, as was mentioned a couple times before, we know that birds like raptors can provide control of small mammals and even other nuisance birds as well. So when we study bird pest control, there are a lot of questions that we can ask about the relationship between birds and habitat. First, we can ask if farms with hedgerows have more birds. We've heard a lot about that today, and I think that we can, in most cases, say yes. So that's going to be definitely a win for the birds. We can ask, does having more birds mean that we're necessarily going to have more pest control? And I think this is sometimes going to be the case, but not in every situation. But then finally, we can just directly ask whether the hedgerow presence is actually going to increase the pest control services and not just increase the number of birds on the farm. So this was the specific question that I wanted to answer because I thought it would be useful information for farmers to have. While we might assume that bringing birds to the farm increases pest control, I wanted a way to scientifically test this question. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to go into some of the details of this experiment. So I conducted this experiment all the way back in 2012 in Humboldt County in Northern California. This was part of my master's research project at Humboldt State University. And so I conducted research on 29 organic farms. You can see a map of where they were located here. So the inset map shows us where we are in California, all the way up in Northern California, Humboldt County. The farms were spread out across this area in Humboldt County. So you can see that some of them were closer to the coast, and then some of them were about 2 hours drive inland as well. And they all had multiple different types of crops being grown. They sold in multiple different outlets, including most of them directly to consumers at farmers markets, which is where I initially made contact with a lot of these farmers. So these are just a couple pictures of some of the farms where I did this research. You can see they varied quite a bit in size and other different characteristics as well. But overall, I did find high bird diversity on and around the farms. So across all of the farms, I detected 105 different bird species. And of those 105, 60 were detected using either the row crop or the hedgerow habitat. So that would exclude birds that were just flying over or things that were seen at a distance. So 105 different, 60 bird species actually using these farm habitats with an average of around 19 bird species per farm. So I decided to focus this study on kale crops. So kale, of course, is a specialty crop. It's grown pretty widely in the area where I was conducting the study, and it was grown on many of the farms that I was working at. So one reason that I decided to work with kale crops is because it's a row crop, but like other brassica crops, it can be susceptible to quite a few different caterpillar pests. And caterpillars, of course, are great food for birds. So they provide this nice, tidy little package of protein. And during the nesting season, it's easy to deliver that to the nestlings. It's basically a high quality food for birds. So I wanted to simulate what birds might do with a caterpillar pest outbreak in this type of system. All right, so again, I'm going to go into some of the details of how exactly I conducted this experiment, just because I think it can be fun to see some of the really weird stuff that we do in the name of science. So I wanted to create a fairly realistic way to simulate caterpillar pest outbreaks on the farms. And what I came up with was a sentinel pest presentation station. That's a lot of words, but basically I took a lacinato kale leaf, or a dinosaur kale leaf. I stuck it in one of these floral water picks to keep it fresh. And then we went out and placed those picks on the ground at the farms. And then I used an adhesive, of course, that's safe for birds, to attach 2 cabbage looper caterpillars to the kale leaves. So you can see in this inset sort of what that looks like. And then we placed these sentinel pest presentation stations out at the farms before dawn. And then we returned about 7 hours later to see what had been eaten. And then if at least one caterpillar had been consumed, we considered that a depredation, and we recorded that. Although in, I think, every situation, we never had one caterpillar removed. So if a bird had found it, they were going to eat both caterpillars. All right, so I threw this photo in just to show that I could not have done this weird science stuff without the help of quite a few people. So we actually had to prepare each of these kale leaf stations the night before we set them out so that they didn't wilt and so the caterpillars would stay fresh. So that meant some really long nights before getting up at dawn, gluing caterpillars to kale leaves. And we placed 20 of these presentation stations on each of the farms in a grid. So the grid was located close to one of the field edges near some sort of natural habitat. And then we also placed motion activated cameras at some of the stations so we could see what species were eating the caterpillars. So these are just some pictures so you can see what some of these stations looked like when they were placed either with or without a camera nearby. So I mentioned before that a lot of these farms were fairly small and they grew multiple different crop types. So that grid of these presentation stations that we placed was often spread across multiple different crops being grown on a single farm. And you can see that here in some of these pictures. So for instance, we've got these presentation stations at the top that are located near strawberry crops, for instance. And then down here, you can see what that camera setup looked like. And then at each of these different stations on a farm, we measured the distance to the nearest uncultivated habitat. So the nearest thing that just was not being cultivated. The dominant type of that habitat, so whether it was grass, tree, shrub, or something that was human-made like a building. And then we measured what the surrounding crop type was around that individual sentinel pest station. All right, so this is the part where we get to watch cute videos of birds eating caterpillars, or at least I think they're pretty cute. We've got this robin here, and you can see that it's eating the caterpillars off of this pest leaf, or this sentinel pest leaf. And so what we found was between 0 and 80% of these stations on a given farm were depredated, with an average of 24% of them having been depredated. And we've got another little video of a robin here. So we had 116 video samples, and of those videos, 10 showed robins consuming the caterpillars, 4 showed scrub jays, and 1 actually showed a starling. I do, however, think it's likely that there were more species of birds that were consuming the caterpillars, but we just didn't catch them on camera for whatever reason. So if you remember, we only had a couple of cameras out per farm. We weren't monitoring each one of those stations. All right, this video does not show a bird, but I actually think it's really cute. What we're looking at here is a little tiny lizard that is trying to pull off a caterpillar, and it's failing. So he's located just right on top of that leaf. It's a little bit backlit, so it's hard to see. This was actually part of a series of several videos where he continues to struggle to pull off this caterpillar and fails and eventually gives up and leaves. So from videos like this, but also from direct observations, we were able to determine that all of the caterpillars that were removed from these presentation stations were removed by birds. And then finally, I'm just showing this one because it's actually my favorite video. We've got a scrub jay here, which is getting one of these caterpillars. So it pulls the caterpillar, drops it, and then just regurgitates a whole big glob of caterpillars. So what we can see here is that this bird had likely been going to a couple of the stations already and collecting caterpillars. It eats that first caterpillar, and then it just picks up and eats that whole big regurgitated glob for whatever reason. So we found that there were 2 categories of variables that significantly predicted the probability that a sentinel pest was consumed by birds. So first, the surrounding crop type where the sentinel pest was placed was important. Pests that were placed among brassica crops, like in the top picture you can see with the robin, were significantly more likely to be depredated than those that were placed among other crop types, like for instance in the picture in the bottom where we've got the pests placed among strawberries. So this is likely just due to the study design. So I was using these brassica pests on brassica leaves. So the birds might just have a better search image among brassica crops for the caterpillars than among crops where they might not normally be found. This finding isn't necessarily relevant to farmers because you're probably or hopefully not out there actually placing pests on your own farms. However, I do think it is really interesting because if the birds potentially already have a search image, that means they're probably already out there looking for these caterpillars in the brassica crops. So my second finding was that the local habitat, so the habitat right at the edges of the farms does significantly affect the probability of depredation by birds. So this is actually in contrast to some of the findings that Sasha was talking about, where she did not find that there was an effect of that local scale variable of the habitat right at the edge of the farm. And this picture is just showing a native hedgerow that was planted on deep-seeded farm, which is one of the farms where I did my study. So first I found that the probability that one of those sentinel pest stations was depredated was highest when the closest uncultivated habitat was a shrub. So the probability when the category was grass or tree or building or man-made was lower than for the shrub category. But grass and tree, and then the third building category, the probability wasn't statistically different from each other for those categories. It was, however, statistically higher probability if the category was shrub that the pest was more likely to be depredated. And then I also found that there was a distance effect. So at those stations that were closer to the field edge had a higher probability of depredation. Again, with those stations that were closer to shrub showing higher probabilities of depredation than those near other habitat categories. So what we're looking at for this graph here along the horizontal axis, we're just seeing increasing distance to uncultivated habitat. And then we've got the probability that a sentinel pest station would be eaten along the vertical axis there. So I should note, however, that many of these sites may have had hedgerows that included both shrubs and trees. For this study, I was only measuring what was absolutely closest to that sentinel pest presentation station. So these results are not suggesting that having trees is going to decrease the probability of depredation. It's only that in this system, having shrubs nearby was correlated with increased bird predation activity. So we know, and we've heard a lot today about how hedgerows are beneficial for birds and contribute to bird conservation. The study that I conducted showed that shrubby hedgerows also have the potential to benefit farmers as well by increasing these pest control services provided by birds. And because the distance from hedgerow also plays a role, we might expect that some of these smaller farms or farms with multiple smaller fields that are broken up by hedgerows might benefit more from pest removal by birds. And this study was only focused on the very local, very small scale variables that could affect pest consumption by birds. So I was really interested in the things that farmers could affect directly, like for instance, planting hedgerows. Obviously, as we've heard before, especially in Sasha's work, the surrounding landscape at a much larger scale is also going to play a role, but I did not examine that here. And so one other thing to note is that this experiment was meant to replicate a pest outbreak with a higher pest density. I actually did conduct a companion study to this one where I went to a small subset of those farms and I placed cages over kale plants. And those cages were meant to keep the birds off so that I could compare the crop yield of kale crops where the birds could access to the crop yield of crops that were control plots that were uncaged. And so what I found was there was no actual difference in the crop yield between these caged and uncaged plants, suggesting that at least in this small subset of farms growing kale, birds were not providing a significant measurable service in terms of crop yield. However, we measured the caterpillar pest densities at the beginning of this experiment, and they were extremely low at the time. So it makes sense that if there weren't that many pests for birds to consume, then we wouldn't necessarily see a difference there. So are birds still important even if we don't see a measurable services in a low pest density year? I would argue that yes, having birds to help protect against outbreaks is going to help just provide resiliency on the farm. So remember that the sentinel pest experiment that I did took place over a very short time period, only 7 hours. And I think the magnitude of the bird response, so with up to 80% of the sentinel pests being eaten within such a short period of time, really suggests just how important birds can be in the face of potential outbreaks. And then finally, I wanted to just briefly talk about the types of natural habitat that surround a farm. So in this study, I found that shrubs along the field margin were the best predictor of depredation, better even than trees. But this is certainly not always going to be the case. So for instance, trees might be more important than shrubs when we're trying to convince birds to forage in systems with trees, like orchards, for instance. But my most recent research, as I mentioned briefly before, in these corn and soybean fields in the Midwest. In this research, I've actually found some evidence that having prairie nearby, and prairie, which is mainly composed of grasses and forbs, can be important for predicting pest control. So I think what we need to do is continue to examine the combinations of different types of agriculture surrounded by different types of natural habitat to see what will maximize services by birds in these different contexts. All right, so I want to just thank all of the farms where I did this research and the people that helped out with that. And I think we maybe have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, we definitely do. Thank you so much, Megan. That was really, really great and really interesting research. So thanks for sharing. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box. I don't see any at this moment, but you might want to just check your chat box, Megan, to see if anybody private messaged or DM'd you there.
I have a question for you, Megan. Thank you for that great presentation. It was really interesting to hear Sasha's presentation and then yours, and know that Sasha found there was a lot of support of birds by hedgerows, but the pest control was really defined by those big trees. That birds really were attracted to those big trees, not so much the hedgerow. But in your situation, where it was interesting to look at the shrubs were most attractive or most predictive of pest control and not trees. And I was wondering what that was about. And it must be, or I'm asking, do you think it's because the arboreal birds, the tree loving birds, aren't going to go out there and forage on the ground? It's going to be the robins and scrub jays that like shrubs that then are going to be down foraging in those lower crops, in the lower row crops.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely going to play a role. And so that was part of the reason why I wanted to do this experiment in the first place, was because so much of that research had been done in places that would be, like for instance, coffee farms. You might expect to find birds there because they sort of can replicate the natural habitat around there, whereas row crops are pretty different from the surrounding natural habitat. And I think we have these different groups of birds. So definitely a tree specialist like a woodpecker, you're not going to expect to find them down in those row crops. But I think things that make use of shrubby habitat might be a little more generalist in their habitat use. So birds like a robin, for instance, might be attracted to the shrubs and then might also be willing to go forage in a row crop type of habitat as well. Whereas a woodpecker probably wouldn't be willing to. And I don't know if Sasha has anything to add to that. But yeah, I think the different types of agriculture definitely plays a role.
Great. Someone did have a question about what kind of glue you use to attach the caterpillars to the kale.
So good question. So it's actually a cyanoacrylate, which is just a super glue type glue, which is technically safe for consumption by birds. So they, any of that glue that they got would be safe for them to consume.
Great. Well, I